This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today we properly kickstart the journey of this fall, which is a journey to the mysteries and the wonders of the human brain. In the prologue, we heard an old conversation that I had with Suzana Herculano-Houzel, who told one of the simplest and most elegant stories I've heard about the origins of the human brain. Today we hear from another neuroscientist who thinks that that story isn't quite right, or at least it only explains a part. My guest is Dean Falk, who I had on the show half a year ago to talk about human evolution more generally. And after we had recorded the proper episode, I asked if she would have a little bit more time to discuss something she had said in the conversation and what I had heard from Suzana Herculano-Houzel before. So for half a year, I've wanted to launch these two together in some sense, and now they found a perfect place. Falk is really an expert in all the details about past brains that we can read from the very limited information that is left in the shape of the skull, endocasts, as we call them. Falk has analyzed all sorts of brains from human fossils, the Hobbit, so-called Hobbit in Indonesia, all the way to the brain of Albert Einstein. And so what has all of this work taught her, and why does she have a different view about the origins of the human brain than my past guest, Suzana Herculano-Houzel? You'll hear it in this episode. The episode will begin with 3 minutes repetition from last spring's episode with Falk, and will mark the transition to the new material. In this beginning part from last spring, I asked Falk if Charles Darwin might have actually been more right than is often realized in his elegant and simple story about the human brain. This time, actually, the simple story gets a little bit of support rather than vice versa. But that discussion opens up this whole mysterious, complicated, messy, but very revealing discussion that we have then later on. So without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this. If you do, as always, you can support the show by subscribing to it if you haven't done so yet. Give it a 5-star review if you think that I deserve it. And of course, share it to anyone who you think that might enjoy it. As always, thank you so much to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. You make this work possible and you make this work rewarding. So this episode, as always, is for you. So let's go again with neuroanatomist Dean Falk.
So with the transition to the ground, it changed the form of the body. And one of the most important things that happened is that the big toes, rather than being in an ape-like position sticking out to the side, in our ancestors eventually moved in and became aligned with the rest of the foot.
It's really remarkable. I remember seeing a photo of a chimpanzee foot from the below, from the sole of the feet.
Yeah.
And I first thought I was looking at a hand.
Yes.
It looks much more like a human hand than it looks like a human foot.
Yes.
The big toe is like a grabbing thumb. And so I think it's really important part of the story is to look at bipedalism, not just as freeing the hands, but also imprisoning the feet. But let's look at the freeing of the hands. I think one thing that's really interesting is that there's been this long idea since Darwin. He speculated, but in a very reasonable way, that there's been a kind of virtuous cycle where when you become bipedal or more bipedal, you free your hands.
Mm-hmm.
You can make more tools. With the making of those tools, you can maybe access more foods, being smarter becomes more important, and that then feeds into brain growth. And then the better brain you are, then the more you can use these tools, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. Right. And that there was a time when this was seen to be, okay, well, that's just not the case. Isn't there a way in which Darwin might have been a bit more right than we give him credit for? And so let me make the case for you. So the standard response to Darwin is that we walked upright, now we know, way before you get brain enlargement and way before you get these stone tool cultures. So it's not a virtuous cycle. But then we can say, hold on a second, as you point out, it's not only stone tools that means. It might very well have been that as we that increased tool usage did start much earlier. We don't have them because they were made of botanic materials.
Right.
Then this refers to another part of your work. So even before we start seeing brain growth, there are these hominin species with changes in how their brains are organized. Not the size, but the organization of the brain. So what the Darwin, if we would bring him to the room now, might say, after having read your book, for example, is that I was right all along. Look, these creatures, they start walking upright. They probably were using much more tools, spears, digging sticks, whatever. And by the way, this is the time when we start seeing interesting changes in the brain. We didn't
Right.
notice them when we were just looking at the brain's size, but we do see it in the organization. So do you think that there is a way in which actually Darwin might have been much more right than he was given credit for during the past, I don't
Yeah.
know, 50 years or so?
Well, he was amazing. He actually got so much right.
Yeah.
And yeah, in terms of your questions about shape, yes, Australopithecines are the lineage that is thought to have at some point, some Australopithecines somewhere in Africa gave rise to the genus Homo. Australopithecine brains are roughly ape size, let's just say. But in the shape of Australopithecine brains, the study you're referring to, I did it with some colleagues in 2000.
Yeah,
We,
exactly.
we looked at the overall shape of the endocast of Australopithecus africanus and compared it to those from another genus, Paranthropus. If you look at the shapes of the endocast, you see that in Australopithecus, there are some expansions that you don't see in Paranthropus. And they are things that we see in us that suggests there's something going on in the brain. We call that reorganization, changes of the internal wiring. And that those kinds of changes may well have preceded them being manifested on the surface of the brain. And
So by the time you can actually see from a broken skull that the brain has started reorganizing, it probably has a long history of having some of that reorganization.
Yeah.
Yes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the kind of mega question, which is, it's obvious that brain size does matter. And you've just made the case that, well, the organization, the shape also does matter. Is there a debate here? For example, I had Suzana Herculano-Houzel on the show earlier, who has done some really fabulous work on counting neurons. And she didn't say to me organization doesn't matter, but after having read her book and talked with her for almost 2 hours, my impression was that organization doesn't really matter. So she was clearly focusing on the size and the amount of neurons. You seem to be more focused on the structure. Can you give your kind of take on where the field is in this debate, or in this difference of emphasis?
Right. I'm not sure there's a consensus in the field. Paleo-neurologists, as we're pretentiously called, who study endocasts, focus a lot on the organization. That's what they're hoping to determine by studying endocasts. Everybody's aware of brain size. Of course, it was important. If you have brains increasing fourfold over time, and you can look at the material culture over that time and see a vast increase, it seems highly likely that there is a causal connection there of brains getting bigger, and they would have been reorganized.
Oh yeah, but I think that's an important point. That there is a tendency with some people in the field to see the reorganization as a red herring, because once you grow the brain, you're gonna have some new folds, and so there are people who say that, look, what if you study the folds and the shape, you're not really studying anything interesting, because it's just kind of an epiphenomenon. It's like an accident from the fact that when you start scaling up, you're gonna get a new shape.
Of course, scaling, the bigger, the more convoluted. So yes, it's true. Scaling is really important, but it's just scaling. What I want to know is, if you look at the behavior of an organism like people, what can you learn about the brain that underwrites, as it were, that behavior? So if we want to say, well, we're just a big scaled up primate, well, yeah, I knew I was a primate, but how do you explain something like grammatical language?
Well, what someone like Herculano-Houzel would say is that we are remarkable in that if you take a prime brain, like from a monkey, and you ask what would a brain of a big primate like us look like if it's able to feed that same, relatively same size brain, you end up with a cortex with almost 15 billion neurons, which is more than any animal in the world.
Right. And I can accept that. But what I want to know is the cognitive stuff and why. And so what are all those neurons in the cerebral cortex doing? And in terms of brain size, if you look at people just as a species, global species, there's no clear correlation between brain size and intelligence. There have been records of people with very small brains who've been brilliant, and vice versa. And there's a big range of variation in terms of brain size in people around the world. The smallest normal brain on record was like 780 cc's in a normal woman.
Really?
In a normal woman. And then there have been brains on record 2,400 cc's. So that's an enormous variation in brain size. So brain size, of course, is important, but it's not the be all and end all. What you need is, it's not just brain size. It's, how, what it's doing, how it's connected.
Very briefly, do we know is there anything we can really say about the debate between relative versus absolute brain size? So again, Suzana Herculano-Houzel massively in favor of absolute brain size as long as it accounts for how many neurons.
But then what do you know from that? What do you know? You know there are a bunch of neurons.
Yeah. So you think relative brain size matters? So
yeah.
So basically, is it that absolute brain size matters, relative brain size matters, and brain organization matters?
And it does. I mean, the brain is a complicated organ.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. And this speaks to your work with Einstein's brain. It wasn't particularly big, but it was a particular brain.
It was, yeah. His brain was absolutely normal size for a 76-year-old man. He died in 1955. He was 76 years old. His brain was like the average size. The corrected size for age was something like 1,352 cubic centimeters. The world average is said to be 1,350.
Right on the spot.
In terms of overall shape, he had a certain lopsidedness, which is typical of our species, where the right sticks out a little bit more there.
Yeah, the kind of left-right asymmetry. By the way, that's such an interesting thing. Do you want to say a little bit, when does that emerge in the human lineage? And then let's continue with Einstein.
Okay, in terms of asymmetry, we know it's super important for how we function. And if you look at apes, their brains are asymmetrical, but they're not as lateralized as we are. For instance, individual apes might prefer one hand or another, but you don't read that 90% of chimpanzees do everything with their right hand. Humans, we are really lateralized towards right-handedness. So maybe 10% of the world population is left-handed. So we're exaggerated in the right-left differences. The right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain, and a part of the brain that's right next to the speech areas, by the way.
And do we know when the asymmetry started being a thing in the human story, the exaggerated lateralization?
So, no, I don't know if anybody says, aha, this is where it happens. I think of it as something that gradually happened with the increase.
Honestly, everything in this conversation just speaks towards gradualism rather than these big leaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's continue with Einstein. Yeah, so he's had this typical to humans lateralization.
Yeah, he's typical of a 76-year-old. But when you started to look at the convolutions, which is what we did, we essentially mapped the entire brain because we had photographs that were taken when he died. There were like 55 photographs. The pathologist meticulously photographed all around the brain, including unconventional views. And these photographs had been stashed away in someone's basement since 1955, and we were able to get them and to then study them. And so we looked at all of the convolutions of the brain. And from the literature, we were able to find detailed descriptions of 85 human brains and statistics on the various sulci, the grooves, and the patterns of grooves in the literature. So we could look at Einstein and see a particular pattern and then go to this literature and say, well, do any of both did any of those folks have this? So we were able to see what looked totally normal and then the parts of the brain that were unusual. And his brain, in all of the lobes of the brain, had places that were unique or highly unusual compared to other people, which was very interesting. And we still don't know how to explain them, but each lobe had something unusual. His Broca's area was highly convoluted in an odd way. It was expanded more than yours and mine probably are.
Interesting.
He had in the frontal lobe on the right side, most of us have 3 kind of big convolutions. There are more criggles in it, but 3 major ones. He had 4.
Okay.
Like, whoa, where'd that come from? And I know where that came from. I could see on the brain, but it was unusual. In the back, the parietal lobes were very asymmetrical in a particular way that I hadn't seen. And, and you wonder why. So those are just some examples, but every single lobe has something unusual about it. And when the brain was harvested, lovely word that, the pathologist, Thomas Harvey, made a chart where he chopped the brain up into 240 blocks, but he made a chart where he would number a block. And so that later he could go to a block, know what number it was, and then look at his chart and see where it came from. So we did this description of the cerebral cortex, provided the roadmap to the slides, told readers where they could get some slides in the hope that people would eventually be curious. So what we saw was a brain that was really unusual, the cerebral cortex, in terms of the convolutions in numerous places. Slides are available, and encourage other people to look into it. Someone did. Weiwei men from China then wanted to know about the part of the brain that connects the right and the left side, the corpus callosum, that connects the right and left sides of the brains.
And the bridge.
And he very cleverly took the photograph, and then he did a study, and he found men that were the right age and was able to image them and able to compare the corpus callosum, and found that Einstein had a really massive connection between the 2 hemispheres. And these are superficial kinds of things, literally. I mean, the cortex is superficial. But it does look that, although that brain was a normal size, it wasn't a normal brain. Of course, we have a little bit of other information about Einstein where we would suspect that anyway.
Yeah, and I guess the Einstein stuff is really fascinating, but I think we should focus actually on the evolution again, because I think Herculano-Houzel herself, she was kind of comfortable saying that within a species this is not the case. Within humans, it's not the bigger brain that matters, whatever the logic. But anyway, so let's focus on the evolution. There would the argument be, for example, what we talked about earlier, that you can have an ape-sized brain, but which starts looking more like human. That to me suggests that we do have to study the shape and not just the size. I mean, the other example would be the Hobbit.
Yeah.
Right, in the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis had a brain the size of a chimpanzee, and when you and others started studying it, you figured out that, oh my god, it's not like a chimpanzee at all. It looks like a human brain, but smaller.
Yeah, so a hobbit's brain's really little, about the size of a chimp brain, a capacity of 417 cubic centimeters. And yet there were like 7 different derived features of the cerebral cortex. But you're not seeing what would have been happening are the connections within the brain that are changing, and the neurochemistry, reorganization would, and the distributed neural networks. So all of that would be entailed in neurological reorganization. And so our brains are different. And if we want to know why, and there are loads of speculations, what drove hominid brain size? Was it social? Social kinds of, this is Dunbar stuff.
What do you think of Dunbar stuff? The idea that if you look at the size of the brain, it correlates with the group size. The bigger the group, the bigger the brain.
Maybe, but what I would point out is that primates, most primates are extraordinarily social as we are. What I want, if I want to know how we're unique or how our brain's unique, I'm going to want to know about a behavior that we have that's unique. And I can only think of one. And that's the grammatical language, because what we can do that no elephant does, no dolphin does, no other primate does, is we can chop up these little bits of air and spit them out in very rapid, meaningful sequences where we can express an infinite number of ideas. And we can hear, we can receive from others an infinite number of ideas. So language is the one thing I can think of. It's not warfare that's been proposed. Chimps, good old chimps, they made war. It's not hunting. Good old chimps hunt. The thing that humans do that's truly unique and that I think is the basis for all those other, for advanced technology today, for mathematics, for music, I think it piggybacks on the networks that were evolved long time ago that formed the substrates that underpinned the emergence of the kinds of complex vocal communications we do. So I think everything else kind of built on that. So it's the connections. And when we see shaped things, it's hinting. When you see Australopithecines who have frontal lobes that are swollen in certain places that you don't see in some hominids like Paranthropus, but it looks human-like, that's hinting that underneath the surface, something was going on to do with brain evolution.
Yeah, there's also really interesting work, I think, from Stout to Dietrich and his collaborators. They've looked at stone tools. Making those complicated stone tools activates the same parts in the brain as grammatical language tasks.
Yes, and Acheulean hand axes. Some cognitive archaeologists have said, aha, this signifies the first major cognitive leap in hominid evolution. And they say their makers clearly had something, an image in mind of what they wanted to produce. It's beautiful, it's bifacial, it's symmetric.
And it has a kind of grammar because you have to do this first in order to do that, or there are these links between steps that are kind of like in grammar.
And I can accept that logic to an extent. What I don't accept is this is the first cognitive leap. What I think is it's one manifestation of a cognitively evolved brain.
Yeah. Well, let's look at these two different ways of studying the brain. One is that, well, it gets bigger, it probably gets better. Another one is, well, it's not just size that matters. If we focus on this, it's not just the size aspect. There are a couple of areas that come to my mind that are really suspiciously, interesting because of, first of all, when they emerge in evolution and also what we know that they're associated with nowadays. For example, if you get injury in these areas, what capacities you lose. I think the most obvious place to start would be Broca's area. Paul Broca, the neurologist, noticed that when this area is damaged, patients cannot produce speech, right? And luckily for people like you and people who are interested in this like me, the Broca's area is not that far from the very surface of the brain, meaning that it does leave a little bit of a mark on the skull, on the endocast. So first of all, how important do you think Broca's area is for the evolution of the human brain? And can you give a quick story of, when do we start seeing signs of it?
Broca's area is a center that does sequencing of little bitty motor activities, not just speech, but it's famous for being a very important center for speech. As you just pointed out, you do not want to get damage in it. If you do, you may know exactly what you want to say to someone, but you just can't find the words. Yeah. It's a sequencer, and it would have been tremendously important for all kinds of activities that require sequencing little bits of information, which the left hemisphere, left side of the brain, is particularly good at compared to the right hemisphere. So Broca's area is important, and what's really nice about it is in people, and It has a particular pattern of little tiny grooves that mark a part of it that you only see in people. You don't see it in other primates.
You say people, who are people? Homo sapiens, also Neanderthals, also early hominins. Where do you see that?
The problem with that's what everybody wants to know.
Yes, I want to know.
The problem with early hominids is, unfortunately, endocasts are a luck of the draw thing. Most of the details of cerebral cortex, the outside part of the brain where we do our quote advanced thinking, do not leave clear impressions in the brain case. Some parts leave better impressions than others. In terms of Broca's area, which is a triangular patch, it's hard to detect. So what paleo-neurologists do is there's sort of a bump there right at that point. And it's where it's sort of a marker of Broca's area. I mean, it's near Broca's area. And so they'll start looking at, well, who has a swelling there? But that's very dicey, because if you look at apes, they have the same Brodmann's areas, they're called, that make up Broca's area in humans, but they're in slightly different places.
So we don't really know what exactly. We know that something changes between. Something is very different between chimps and humans. This place is important, but we don't exactly know how different does it need to be remarkably different.
Right. And we also know that apes have their own very dramatic configuration there, their own particular sulcus that looks different than the ones that involved in Broca's area. It's still an open question being debated, because paleo-neurologists, as you probably know, argue ferociously about identifications of the particular things that do appear when they do appear on endocasts. And it gets even worse when you go to the back end of the brain.
But what about the front end?
Right.
So the Brodmann area 10, BA10.
Yes.
Very, very interesting area. Very, very front of the brain. If you read books from like Joseph Ledoux, neuroscientist, thinks that this is like, to understand consciousness, you have to understand this, like BA10, because this is the kind of highest order representer, which represents what's going on in other parts of the brain. I've heard him say, for example, things like he's not convinced that if you don't have BA10, you might not feel emotions at all in the way that we feel. Let's not go into that speculation, but the point is, it's a really massive deal. and this was one of the things, looking back in our conversation to this not big brain but special brain Australopithecines. Do you remember right? They had already marks of this BA10.
It's more human-like. It's more squared off here. There is a projection here, which would be BA10. So it's looking like something's going on in there, and it is very important for higher cognition. It's involved in switching between ruminating about the external world and paying attention to it, and then thinking more internally, thinking about yourself, thinking about social relationships.
Interesting. So kind of the boundary between me and the world in front of me, that moving in between that boundary.
It's very important for internal ruminations and for creativity and for entertaining scenarios about, wonder if this happens, what would I do there? And for apparently for emotional processing too, for understanding emotions in others. So it's really important. And it also is involved in things like reading and imagining other worlds or scenarios. Katarina Semenderfi has looked at comparative BA10 in different apes and humans, and has suggested that some of this internal architecture became more complicated in humans, which makes total sense. In terms of fossils, where the endocast looked really extraordinary in BA10's hobbit, Homo floresiensis. And it's hard to interpret this for various reasons. but it's a little tiny, ape-sized endocast, and it had all these advanced shapes on it.
So that really speaks to the fact that you can have a very human-shaped brain without being human-sized brain. So the size is not all that matters.
Yes.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. In the next episode, we won't be journeying through time to the origins of the brain. Rather, we're going to take a journey within. We're going to look at the architecture and the musicality of the brain and how that sustains all the things that make our consciousness, also studying all the things that can go wrong in our consciousness. So stay tuned for the next episode with the neurologist and author Dr. Priya Anand. Until then, take care.